going to talk about plant diversity now. First of all, I'm just going to go through kind of a general outline of plant diversity, and then we'll talk more specifically about the different phyla, etc. You can stop this right now, take notes if you would like to, and but otherwise we'll just go through the groups. So first of all, plant diversity, there's two basic types, non-vascular and vascular. And what that's referring to, of course, is the vessels that go through the plant that transport water and nutrients through the plant, including photosynthates, which are sugars. And then underneath the vascular, there are two main groups, seedless and seeded. And then underneath the seeded, there are two main groups, gymnosperms and angiosperms. And of the angiosperms, which means flowering plants, are monocotyledon and eucotyledon. It's EU, just by the way. It's kind of written close together there. All right, so also I wanted to show you, this is Appendix E, so this is where you're looking in your textbook. And it is showing you that Plantae, which is the kingdom, so this is under the domain Eukarya, kingdom, a supergroup, Archaeoplastida, and the kingdom Plantae, and of that there are these different phyla. Now the groups that I was just mentioning to you are over here. Non-vascular plants are sometimes called bryophytes, and then vascular plants are going to be everything else. Okay, so all of these are vascular plants. And then you have the seedless plants, which are going to be these two phyla, and everything else is seeded, all right? And then you have the gymnosperms, which are these phyla, and then you have the angiosperms, which are these, okay? So, and then underneath these, we will have the groups monocot and dicot, okay? So that would be classes, okay? All right, so those are the only two classes really that we're going to cover for plants. So let's just go through this a little bit more. Another thing I wanted to show you before we move on, sorry, is this. And this is in your textbook also, and this is just another way of looking at it. This is talking about like when things would have come about, okay? So it's talking about, we have an ancestral group of green algae, which led to the Carophyceans, and those are what we were talking about, is the type of green algae. And then everything else are land plants. So that's all of these guys. These are the non-vascular plants, and these are all the vascular plants, seedless and seeded, all right? And then you can see we have gymnosperms and angiosperms, all right? So those are the, just a kind of another way of looking at it. You should become familiar with all the different ways of looking at these kinds of diagrams, all right? So because otherwise it'll be confusing to you. Okay, so first of all, non-vascular plants, or bryophytes are sometimes what they're called, have three phyla. The phyla are Hepatophyta, which is a liverworts, not liverwurst, phyla Anthoceurophyta, which is hornworts, and phyla Bryophyta, which are mosses. Mosses are going to be probably the most common thing that you would see around here in a forest, and typically, sometimes people confuse mosses and lichens. We'll talk about lichens when we talk about fungi. But because they look kind of similar in the ecosystem. And mosses, though, are the simplest types of land plants. And one of the things about mosses that you should know, besides their life cycle, we're going to go over the life cycle, is the fact that they are just about 2 cell layers thick. All parts of their life cycle are only about 2 cell layers thick. So they literally live in moist environments, and they will be, they can live in a lot of different moist environments, by the way, a lot of different temperatures, etc. And they do not have true roots, even though this is kind of showing some root-like structures. These are called rhizoids, and they are just cell extensions of the cells that are on the bottom part of this little protonema thing, which is just like a runner, so to speak. But because none of this has vascular system in it, it's not considered a true root. But these things do hold them to the substrate, much like the holdfast of the thallus in the other algae that we were talking about. All right, so there's two parts of this life cycle, and this will lead us to this idea of alternation of generations. But let's first just go through the life cycle. This structure, called the gametophyte, is a one-in structure. So notice it is a multicellular structure, and it is going to have parts on the gametophyte that will give rise, that is, they will grow a structure called an archegonium that has one cell in it that is going to be the egg. All right, so that's where that is. And the other structure that will grow on the gametophyte is called an antheridium. This is a male or a sperm producing structure, and so these cells here will produce, actually have one cell that divides many times, all of this through mitosis, to make these sperm, which are flagellated, and because of that they will need water to swim to the egg. All right, so these have to be, they're going to be doing this fertilization or sexual fusion. They should have just called it fertilization. They will be doing that when there's water available. So if it was a dry time of the year, that would not be happening then. All right. So then what's going to happen is it creates a zygote. This is a 2N structure. So from here on out, up here is 2N. That will grow into these things, which are called the sporangia. Now these are 2N structures. This is the gametophyte that is down here. So this would be on this part, the egg, or will become the zygote that is growing into this. Okay? And then this is called the sporophyte. The sporophyte or sporangia will have this little capsule thing that will do meiosis and produce haploid spores that will then grow on the ground and become this filament, and this filament then will grow into this gametophyte. All right, so that's the basic life cycle. You should know that life cycle for testing purposes. There is another version of this in your textbook. The reason why I'm showing you this is that clearly with the colors shows the sporophyte part, which is this part. They have it reversed from how we talked about it. This is the sporophytic structure, okay, and making the sporangium. This is the 2N structure, and then it will produce the gametophyte, which is grows into this longer thing called a protonema, and then that will grow into the gametophytic multicellular structure that has archegonium and antheridium that produce egg and sperm. Okay, so it's the same life cycle, just kind of a different view. Gametophyte up here, sporophyte down here. Now this clearly shows alternation of generations, meaning multicellular structures, both 1N gametophyte and 2N sporophyte. The sporophyte in this case is the shortest part of the life cycle, and the gametophyte is the longest. And you're going to see as we go through the plant groups, it kind of switches over. Okay, and when it switches over, this is what we call the reduction of the gametophyte. But right now, we have a strong gametophytic structure. If you saw a moss out in the wild, it would be the gametophyte, because these are very, first of all, short-lived, and secondly, they are kind of they don't really show up easily. You have to really look for them, and we'll see those in the lab. All right? So the next group is seedless vascular plants. Seedless vascular plants have flagellated sperm also. They also need moist environments because of that. And the traits of vascular plants, of course, are that they have xylem and phloem. These are the vessels that I was talking about that transport materials. And the xylem transports water, phloem transports sugar. We will talk a lot more about that later. They will have true roots. This is structures like the rhizoids that we were talking about for anchorage and absorption, but they have vascular system in them. They have true leaves, that is, they have structures that have vascular system in them that are a surface area for photosynthetic action. And then they have this thing called the reduction of the gametophyte, which is what I just mentioned, but as we look at the life cycle, I'll talk about it a little more. And then the seed or sporophyll is just a structure to protect the zygote. So different plants have different things. Ferns have sori. These are protecting the haploid cells. Some plants have strobili or cones. And some plants are homosporous, which means they have one type of sporophyll or spores, and that some are heterosporous, meaning they have two types, egg and sperm. All right, so that's as we go through the groups, there will be some differences in how the plants are doing that particular thing, but all of them have a way of protecting the zygote. All right. Now, the phyla in the seedless vascular plants, there's two of them. There's Lycophyta and Monolophyta, sorry. And that used to be called by another name, so you might see that it used to be called Pterophyta. So just so you know, that's kind of the same thing. So Lycophyta are club mosses, spike mosses are quillworts. A lot of you might not know these plants very much. They're kind of nondescript in the ecosystems around here. Many of them are what they call epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that really don't have much of a root system and typically use other structures like trees to hold them up in the sunlight, and they will be like in the crooks of branches or something like that, using the small amount of organic matter. So a typical one of these are bromeliads, which you might know those because they sell those because they're really pretty. These guys also typically have upright stems and very small leaves. The gametophyte or the multicellular gametophyte structure is underground. They can have branched roots, and they are club mosses are homosporous, and the other two spike mosses and quillworts are heterosporous. Okay, so the Monolophyta are the are whisk ferns, horsetails, and ferns. Whisk ferns have branched stems. They don't really have any roots at all. They're epiphytes also. They have 3 fused sporangia. They're homosporous, and the gametophyte is underground. So they're kind of similar to Lycophyta. The main thing is their life cycle is a little different, and we'll go over that in a sec. Horsetails have very gritty texture. They have long, skinny stems. They're homosporous, and they have a ring of leaves on the stem joints. You might have seen these at Kanapa Gardens. They have a whole bunch of them near the bridge that goes over the Koi area, if you've ever been there. And they typically like wet soils. In fact, there's a whole bunch of species. I think there's something like, I don't know, 15 or 20 species or something like that of horsetails. And then there are ferns, and there's a lot of ferns, like 12,000 species of ferns. These were thought to be the first major vascular plants on land, and they used to be some giant ferns. You might have seen pictures of prehistoric times with ferns, so they're considered old in terms of evolution. They have megaphylls, which means leaves, and they have horizontal stems. They have something called a fiddlehead, and that's just where the leaf is coming out. It's kind of curled up and then it uncurls. They are also homosporous, and the gametophyte is sheds after the sporophyte forms, so basically it disappears. So most of the time you would not see that. And they have what they call sori on the back of the leaves. We will talk about that in the lab. Okay, so let's just look at this for a second. This is just the evolution. Let me see if I can get this right. The evolution of leaves. There we go. So they're talking about if you had like a, vascular tissue and you had just a stem, which horsetails are kind of like, they're just like basically a stem with these projections that come off here and there. And then they're saying as leaves, as plants got more on land and were developing, then they started branching these areas. And as they had branched these areas, then they could add tissue to those branches. And those became the true flat or megaphylls that we want to consider in the fern. okay? But horsetails would be kind of, you know, a precursor to that. So that's just kind of development of leaves in terms of evolution. Now, in the ferns, this is the fern life cycle. So down here we have the sporophyte. The sporophyte, remember, is the 2-end structure. And up here is the gametophyte. The gametophyte is the 1-end multicellular structure. So again, alternation of generations. In this case, though, the sporophyte becomes more prominent in the life cycle. So if you saw a fern and you said, this is a fern in the ecosystem, you would be looking at the sporophyte. So this is what they mean by reduction of gametophyte, because the gametophytic part of the life cycle is now reduced to a small feature. And in the lab, you'll see how small they are compared to these. In the life cycle here, they've drawn them larger, but they're really not as large as these, okay? So again, the life cycle, meiosis produces spores in these little structures that are on the back of these leaves called sori. Here they are right here represented. And the sori then will have the sporangia that does meiosis, that produces the spores, grows into a young gametophyte. The gametophyte will have archegonium and antheridium. Okay, the archegonium are a little higher, that is producing the egg, and the antheridium are a little lower. As there is water in the ecosystem, the sperm can swim up to the archegonium. So if there's no water there, then there won't be fertilization. So it needs dampness for that part of their life cycle at least. And then fertilization forms the zygote, grows into the sporophyte. In a fern, the gametophyte then will slough off, and it becomes the mature sporophyte. Okay? Now just a couple of other notes about ferns before we leave here. They think that as ferns became more prevalent on land, so they were the first vascular plants, and they were the first large sporophytic structure and larger vascular plant with leaves, megaphylls, right? They think that the carbon dioxide levels went down, and as those carbon dioxide levels went down, glaciation occurred. And what that meant was drier climates, because glaciers take up water, and so that water then is not on land, and drier climates led to things like seeds, all right, which is why we go from this seedless group of vascular plants to the next group, which is going to be seeded.